Dan Van Ness. Right now I work at Prison Fellowship International and work on restorative justice issues around the world. I went to law school in Chicago at DePaul Law School. And I did it because I felt called by God to do that. I was trying to decide between being a minister or a lawyer. And I volunteered at a legal aid office down the street. I was working for a year, seeing if I get drafted. And it was night work, and I had nothing to do during the day, so I volunteered at the legal aid office. And it didn't take very long being there and realizing the problems people were coming in with were not complicated. The only problem was that their landlord or the commercial, the business that they had contracted with felt they could do whatever they wanted to, and unless a lawyer called and said, "You've got to stop doing this," and that was an awful lot of the work that they were doing. And I don't know why that made me feel called to do it, but I did. So I went to law school with that in mind. I was going to do legal work for people who would otherwise be denied justice because they didn't have somebody who could stand in the breach for them. And while I was during law school, did volunteer work at a prison, doing civil legal work. Worked at a legal aid office in Cabrini Green during my senior year, and then worked for Cabrini Green Legal Aid in Chicago for a year. Then started my own office on the west side of Chicago, which worked on it was not legal aid. We charged everybody something, but it was on a sliding scale. So I think it was one person we didn't charge at all. It was the middle of the winter. It was no money for gas, and the gas had been turned off and needed to be turned back on, and she really had no money at all. But everybody else paid at least $5. And what I found actually was that because they paid, I had a different relationship with them. They now had hired me, and I was treated actually with more respect. Whereas when it was free, it was kind of, they had gotten used to, unless you're the squeaky wheel or demanding, nothing will happen. So I was practicing law. I was representing criminal defendants in Chicago and heard about these victim offender meetings that people were talking about, Mennonites were doing, and that it was very powerful and people felt good about it. And would I like to go? And I said, well, how does it work? And he said, well, the defendant starts out admitting that he was guilty, and then they meet together, come up with an agreement about what the sentence will be, go back to the judge and see if the judge agrees. And I thought that was a lousy idea, because the only thing that my clients had to negotiate on was the plea of guilty. They could make the state try them, or they could plead guilty, and that was about all they had. They didn't have anything else. And so why would they give that away, not knowing what the sentence is going to be, walk in, meet with a victim, who knows what they would ask for, and then take that agreement to a judge, and who knows what the judge will do. So I didn't even bother attending this process, which is interesting in retrospect. I could have been there when it was first starting, but missed out on it. So I practiced law in Chicago for 5 years on the west side, continued doing that kind of work, and then attended a meeting in the DC area that Prison Fellowship had put on. Prison Fellowship was started by Chuck Colson when he got out of prison to do ministry in prisons. But he had been a politician, worked for Richard Nixon, and he had a number of friends that had been now elected to office in different states. So when he would travel to meet with them about the prison ministry, they would also talk to him about their justice system. And very often what they wanted to do was build more prisons, bigger prisons, prettier prisons. And Chuck said, that's a lousy idea. I've been in prison, I understand what prisons do and don't do. You don't need more prisons, you need fewer prisons. And instead should be doing things like restitution centers in Georgia and other programs. And he had a good argument. He's a very intelligent man, and he had put together, I mean, he understood the problem very well. He could articulate it to the point that they would say, well, I want more information on that. But he didn't have anybody who could assemble the information and then could help them develop political support, because these are legislators. They also didn't want to do something that was suicidal. So at the end of the meeting, it turned out they'd been looking for somebody to head up a department that would be doing that, or be a department, and then eventually it would grow. they felt that should be a lawyer. They had interviewed a number of lawyers who couldn't afford to pay, to work at what they were offering to pay. So they asked if I'd be interested in coming, and for me it was a salary increase. The benefit of starting out with poverty law is you start low, and so everything is. So my wife and I decided we were ready to do that. For me, that was still pursuing justice for people who would be denied it, but now instead of doing it in court, I'd be doing it in the legislative process. My job basically was to provide information to legislators and then organize citizen task forces that were made up of business people. They were generally people who were involved in the work of Prison Fellowship, so they were, because of their connection with Colson, they tended to be politically conservative. And they were not the groups that legislators were used to coming into their office saying, we've got to do something different about our criminal justice system and start diverting people from prison. And so they got an audience. And we were able to put together some interesting coalitions with Democrats that had been pushing this for a long time. Republicans didn't listen, but let's come in with something that's a little bit different. The arguments are a little different, but it accomplishes the same thing. The first state that I worked in was Washington State. The second was Indiana. And while in Indiana, promoting a Community Corrections Act, the expansion of funding to that had been done on a pilot basis. I met Mark Umbright, who was working with a victim offender mediation program in Valparaiso that he had started. He had actually started in Elkhart with Howard Zayer. Howard Zayer brought victim offender, they call it reconciliation programs, from Canada, where they had first started in Kingston, a group of Mennonites. Howard, as a Mennonite, heard about it. He started something in Elkhart. Mark worked with them for a while and then started his own program in Valparaiso. And they had been doing this for some time and had realized there was a real difference in what was happening, both in terms of recidivism, but also in terms of satisfaction with justice being done, both for victims and for offenders. And so Mark wanted me to know about restorative justice if I was going to be promoting or doing some lobbying, that I should know about the idea. And subsequently I met with him and with Howard, and initially we were lobbying for increased funding for community corrections because they could apply for that funding that would help pay for what they were doing. But the larger question for me was, we're working on public policy. Mark was running this program and he was evaluating it. He was doing a great job keeping track of what was happening, and he was just, those were his skills. Howard was kind of stepping back from running the program. There were other people who were doing the one in Elkhart, but he was thinking big picture. This is a whole new paradigm of justice, and putting on his political science hat and thinking about where does this take us from a vision perspective. But we were lobbying, and so we were somewhere in between. How does that vision, we can see it apply in this particular kind of program, but if we're going to lobby for change and move it in a more restorative direction, what are the elements of that? At about the same time, I had spoken to a politician in Florida who told me that after I'd given him all my arguments for diverting people from prison, which were essentially, it's a big waste of money and it makes them worse. He said, so you're telling me that I can't afford to send people to prison, so I can't afford first-rate justice, but instead I can afford second-rate justice, alternatives to incarceration. And I realized that that wasn't a good argument to be making. That's not the position that I wanted to be in. It's not what I believed. And so I was thinking, now why then is the system not working? Why is it so ineffective? Why is sending people to prison such a mistake? And how would I figure that out in terms that I could explain simply to somebody and not have to go through a history of prisons and their failures and all of that?